This is PD World. I am SYED and you are watching Fault Lines. Rwanda's genocide of 1994 was one of the worst examples of terrorism and genocide within a country in our contemporary history. Started from April to July 1994, 1 million people were slaughtered in Rwanda. This violence started with the death of Hutu president, and Hutu was the majority tribe in the country. Taking advantage of this incident, the minority Tutsi tribe was brutally slaughtered across the country. During this very sad event, a very famous person who later became famous was Paul Rusesabagina. And Rusesabagina was a hotel manager who had saved the life of almost 1,200 people during the slaughter. Later, Hollywood made a movie about his heroic act, and he shot to fame. Not only he left the country, but he also took refuge in Belgium, where he took Belgian nationality, resided in the United States for a long while, and remained a major critic of President Paul Kagame. President Paul Kagame is Rwanda's president since year 2000, in power for straight 22 years, and allegedly have silenced many of his oppositions. Recently, there was a case in the court wherein Paul Rusesabagina, who was forcefully abducted from UAE, has been sentenced 25 years of imprisonment. Team Fault Line have prepared a package, but some part of package might be disturbing for some of my viewers. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
A former senior Rwanda official, Laurent Biusi-Baruta, accused of complicity in genocide against members of the minority Tutsi community, has gone on trial in Paris. The trial is expected to last 2 months and will feature more than 100 witnesses, including survivors from Rwanda who have flown over or will appear via video conference. French government had long been under pressure from activists to act against suspected perpetrators of 1994 Rwanda genocide who had taken refuge on French soil. The case is the fourth to come to court in France from the Rwanda genocide, in which an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered by ethnic Hutu extremists in 100 days of slaughter. The UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Tanzanian town of Arusha to prosecute the perpetrators. A suspected financier of Rwanda genocide, Felicien Kabuga, an alleged architect and financier of mass murder, was arrested near Paris in 2020. France has generally refused requests to extradite suspects to Rwanda, promoting President Paul Kagame to accuse Paris of denying Rwanda jurisdiction. Rwanda's current president has earlier accused France of backing those who carried out the massacres, a charge denied by Paris. French President Emmanuel Macron ordered the 15-member commission in May 2019 to shed light on what happened in Rwanda between 1990 and 1994, which recognized France's overwhelming responsibilities in failing to halt the massacres.
My first guest in the program is Mr. Anjan Sundaram. He's joining me on Skype. He is an expert of African studies as well as an author. I welcome you, Mr. Sundaram, to my program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we are discussing the rise of Rwanda. I mean, before jumping to the subject, the rise of Rwanda from 1994 to this day. This was a major humanitarian crisis, perhaps the worst of its kind that we see in contemporary history. Tell us briefly about Rwanda rising from this day to this day.
So, since the 1994 genocide, as you pointed out, in which nearly 1 million Tutsis were killed, Rwanda has been ruled by Paul Kagame in an authoritarian state. It's a dictatorship today, and like many dictatorships, it's imposed law and order. It's built roads and schools and hospitals. It's kind of, the economy has seen some growth. But I think what's important to realize is that, like many dictatorships, like in Iraq, like in Syria, under Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad, I think the country has seen gains, but these gains are fragile. So often dictatorships end in violence, and I think that may well be the possibility here too. And so all this progress that has been made from since the genocide could be a large part of that could be wiped out in potential violence. And so there's been progress, but one has to be careful how you portray it, because there's also great risks of more violence, unfortunately, to Rwandan people.
Completely understood, but tell me, because we know very little about this part of Africa. So tell my viewers how Paul Kagame stays in power for straight 20 plus years. This is very difficult in any known form of democracy in this part of the world.
So of course it's not democracy. Of course there were elections, but the elections are not free and fair. The last election in 2017, Paul Kagame won with more than 99% of the vote. And over the last, elections are held every 7 years. Anybody who challenges him, people have turned up, beheaded, he's imprisoned them. There have been social media campaigns, circulating nude pictures of his opposition candidates. So it's a very, very difficult thing to challenge Paul Kagame in Rwanda. And that's why also you mentioned to your viewers that there's a court case in France and people are being flown over from Rwanda as witnesses in this case. It's very difficult for anybody to say anything, any Rwandan to say anything that Paul Kagame doesn't want them to say. Because in Rwanda, if you speak against the president, your children might be thrown out of school, you might lose a bank loan, you might end up in jail. It's a very, very strictly controlled country. The whole country is divided into little villages. Each village is about 100 families, and each village is governed by a chief, an informer, and orders pass from the center to these villages very efficiently. And so if you, for example, have a guest in your home, your local chief will know that, and that information will pass to the center very quickly. And so there's very little privacy. If you say something against the president, the authorities will know. It's very, very tightly controlled. And that's how Kagame won the election, the last election, with 99% of the vote.
99% is something more than what Bashar al-Assad got in Syria. But let's move forward. And John, when I was preparing for this program, I just went to the website of World Bank. And it has some astonishing figures for Rwanda. What it states is that 11.1% rise in GDP, 16.5% uptake in exports, and 35% rise in some specific exports that the government had prioritized. Apparently, the economy is not as bad as would be for most of the African nations, particularly from the sub-Saharan Africa. And now, do you really appreciate this economic progress made during the government of Paul Kagame that you have told me is not a completely democratic government? But still, are they doing enough for keeping the economic life of the country intact?
So it's hard to say, are they doing enough? Because really the Rwandan people should answer that question, and they should be able to answer that question in a free and fair election, which they're not able to. So that would be my answer there. I think the economic progress that you cite, some of it is real, for sure. I think many dictatorships, even in Iraq, even in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, there was economic growth. I think the figures are disputed, because the World Bank doesn't really verify figures provided to it about economic growth from each country. They just publish what each country submits to them. And so recently, over the last few years, there have been many academic scholars, economists, who have anonymously posted much of Rwanda's data, economic data, online. And they've pointed out that these figures that you cite, 11% and so on, they're very, very dubious and very unlikely to be true. So I think you should take it with a pinch of salt, but also understand that, yes, there has been some economic stability, there has been some economic growth. Again, like I said, it's fragile, because when there's one person ruling the country, all power is concentrated in one person. When that person loses power, usually there's violence, and then there's economic decline. And so one has to be very careful how you couch this. I think there's an element also of racism with regard to Rwanda. People say, hey, this is an African country that knew a genocide, and so stability, economic growth, this is enough. They don't need democracy. They don't need long-term sustainable growth. They don't need sustainable peace. whatever they get is enough for them. And so I think there's an element of that as well in saying that, for Rwandans who've known a genocide, a little bit of progress, a dictator, that's good enough.
And the recent incident that we are here talking about is of the Rusesabagina, who has been brought forcefully to the country, has been trialed for 6 months, and now sentenced for 25 years. He's 67 years old, which means likely he's going to live rest of his life in jail. Quickly tell me if he was really such a big problem for the government that they had to run an extra mile to get into the country.
So you're very right. I met Paul Rusesabagina in Washington, D.C. When my book about Rwanda was being published. I gave a talk, he was present, and he told me that he was really scared of going back to Rwanda because he was afraid he would be killed. And now Rwanda has forcibly kidnapped him in the UAE and brought him back to Rwanda. I think he was really, really a threat to Paul Kagame because Paul Kagame is Tutsi, he's from the minority, but Paul Rusesabagina is Hutu. He's from the majority. 85% of the country approximately is Hutu. And so were Paul Rusesabagina, the former Hotel Rwanda manager, to stand in elections against Paul Kagame, a huge chunk of the country, both Hutu and Tutsi, because he saved Tutsis during the genocide, would vote for him. And so Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, became really, really scared that Rusesabagina, who's this really popular figure both at home in Rwanda and abroad with powerful friends in Hollywood, in Washington, D.C. He won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the U.S. George Bush gave him that medal. So he has a lot of influential friends, and Paul Kagame needed to take him out because Paul Rusesabagina became such a powerful political challenger.
Thank you very much, Anjan Sundaram, for being guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Mr. Anjan Sundaram, author of a book called Stringer. There's another book that he has written, is called Bad News, The Last Journey in Dictatorship from Rwanda. What he mentioned in the program is his immense concerns about the dictatorship. When I shared these economic figures of progress that Rwanda has made, apparently, though it's a very small economy of $10 billion of GDP, he said the people of Rwanda should be extended the right to convey if they are satisfied with the performance of the government or not. Second guest joining me on Skype would be Julius Beluto, UK-based Kenyan broadcaster and an expert of African affairs, who regularly joins me in my program when we talk about Africa. In a while, he's going to join me, and we are going to discuss this particular incident of arrest of Mr. Rusesabagina, who is a very important person as identified by my previous guest. One important thing that he mentioned is that as a politician, he had intentions to be a politician who wanted to contest elections while remaining abroad, and also the fact that he was a real problem for the government of Paul Kagame. Welcome to the program, Mr. Julius Beluto.
My pleasure. Can you hear me though?
I can hear you. Julius, we are discussing the problems that Rwanda is facing at the moment, and the recent arrest of a very famous person who has brought big name to the country and is behind the bars. The trial went for 6 months. He's been given a sentence for 25 years. Tell me briefly about his significance. We don't know much about his political significance for the country.
The history of Rwanda is riddled with controversies, key controversies. But most of the, when you think about Rwanda, think about what happened in 1994, the genocide. And therefore, I do hear different narratives which are totally different. There's a Western narrative whereby, human rights violations and dictatorship and all that. Then again, you have the narrative from Rwandese themselves. Most of the time I talk, I interact, I mingle with Rwandese people. Somehow they quite love the idea that Kagame kept their country at peace after a very heavy time of war and killings that took place during the genocide. So sometimes it depends on who is talking and what are they saying. There are so many different narratives. Of course, the kidnap, as it has been called, or allegedly being represented of this gentleman, and also prosecution, tends to be very controversial, the way it was conducted. But sometimes when you're on the ground in Africa, when you're on the ground in Rwanda, all these people are extremely educated. They know what's happening around in their world. Even as we call that as kidnap, sometimes you go back to how things have been done previously. What about Guantanamo Bay? Talk about the way people were being taken from one country to Guantanamo Bay by the US. When you look into that, how it was done, it's like, okay, is a focus on Africa and not elsewhere? Not long ago, we had controversy, or almost of the similar matter, touching on Nigeria and Kenya and UK. This is a character known as Kanu.
Julius, the President Kagame allegedly is famous for silencing his opposition. There are more than 300 political murders taken place, which apparently, I mean, there are no reasons for me to believe whether he has done it or not. But as reported in Western media, the opposition of President Kagame has been silenced with the use of brute force, both in the country and abroad. Your quick take on it.
You are right. And again, we are talking about Western media. And what the Western media is also all the time reporting about Rwanda. But can I say, number one, as it has been alleged, human rights violations, is documentation of that happening. We cannot deny the presence of it. But in terms of whether this is the work of Kagame or not, that's a different picture altogether. I want to just raise an issue whereby we have seen Kagame, when all the Western media came up with reports like this, and I'm not standing a bit back to see a bit more clearly. We have seen, for example, Kagame ban BBC because he called BBC genocide deniers. We have seen other media channels that have always fallen into the same. So although we see Western media extremely keen to see what's happening now, and also we see Kagame denying, sometimes when it's two narratives, it's difficult to always say, yeah, that's what's happening. But when you look into there's Rwandese on the ground, well, there's something I just maybe want to share in terms of innocent people, civilians, people who come through and experience war. It's never the same. Give you an example, 2000 election, post-election violence in Kenya, and Kenyans were like, it was very short, but not as, like Rwanda, but they were like, let's never ever go back there again. But to see what happened in Rwanda, the divisions that brought the country to the genocide, and the idea that out of that ashes and of darkness, a country like Rwanda is where it is today, is still Kagame in power. I just want to say it's never easy to run a country. You get criticism. Sometimes you do things, you use force, violence. It's the nature of leadership. But I'm not in any way trying to justify Kagame.
But Beluto, but importantly, Rusesabagina has been brought into the trial in a wrong way. He has been actually abducted from UAE, brought illegally to Rwanda. And the trial that has been aired on YouTube and many other social media outlets have already triggered a lot of hue and cry among the humanitarian organizations that believe that the trial was not really respecting many international treaties that bars Rwanda to follow specific protocols for running such trials. They believe it is a pre-decided scenario. What's your quick take on it?
I am here in the UK, contrary to what perhaps maybe even a lot of critics may not believe. Kagame has been a great friend to former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. Kagame has been a great friend to the US as well. And therefore, on one hand, you get all this criticism about how he does his own thing, how he's brutal, how he's dictatorial. But let me just remind you that Kagame is extremely embraced in the West, some of the countries in the West. And I just wanted to say that even these countries in the West have played a role for Kagame to be still there as a president, and what he does, yes, human rights violations without a doubt, but at the end of the day, what makes him stay in power, what makes him or his action resonate with the rest of the Western world? We get a lot of criticism, but when you look into the mainstream of politics, especially in the West, these countries maybe they have no leg to stand on. As I shared with you earlier, the way Guantanamo Bay prisoners were carried through different countries is not so much similar. As I was sharing to you, this is not also unusual in African setting. I'm not saying it's the right way to do things.
You're right.
Not long ago, you have Kanu being caught up from the UK. He was a citizen of Kanu, accused in Nigeria for staging the rebellion of Biafran war. And then he ends up in Kenya. And from Kenya, he's taken to Nigeria and he's being prosecuted there. So these things tend to happen. Sometimes when you go through the law, when you go through international standards, when you go respect for human rights, then you have a case of the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, who
Julius Beluto,
years.
Julius, you have just hit the nail on its head. Since we're running short of time, we would rather close the conversation on its very pinnacle, but very rightly pointed out. And thank you very much for substantially adding to our program once again. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Julius Beluto. A very important point that he has made is that while most of the Western nations are protesting on the wrongful way of bringing him to the country, Rusesabagina to the country, it is very important, as Beluto pointed out, that even the United States has been picking up people from around the world to be brought to Guantanamo and to keep them under lock-up and to keep them under conditions that would not be allowed constitutionally within the United States. So in a world of dual standards, such criticism will always meet teetering answers. We'll take a break and we'll join you back with the second segment of program. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Philippines and elections, general elections have been concluded. 6-year term for President Rodrigo Duterte has come to an end. And guess who has won the elections? The winner of the election is Marcos Jr., also known as Bong Bong. Marcos Jr. is son of his namesake. His father was Fernando Marcos, an infamous leader of the country, who was famous for many acts of human rights violation, also acts of corruption, and he was overthrown in a people's revolt back in 1986. Many in the country believe that the one of Bong Bong will actually spoil the relationship with the West in general and the United States in particular, because the family is facing trials against human rights violations and financial crimes in the United States. In this general election, a president, vice president, 12 senators, 300 legislators, 18,000 officials, including governors, deputy governors, mayors, and deputy mayors, have been elected for the country. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
In one of the most consequential presidential elections in the Philippines' history, the son and namesake of the former president, Ferdinand Bong Bong Marcos Jr., has won a landslide presidential election victory, signaling an astonishing reversal in the fortunes of the Marcos dynasty. The return of Marcos dynasty to the Malacanang Palace 36 years after the family fled a mass uprising exhibits dramatic shift in country's political landscape. The outgoing vice president of the Philippines, Leni Robredo, who positioned herself as promoting good governance, transparency, and human rights during her election campaign, acknowledged her defeat. According to a partial and unofficial tally of the Commission on Elections, Marcos Jr. has secured about 30 million votes, more than double that of his closest rival, the outgoing vice president, Leni Robredo, who has about 14 million votes. Marcos Jr.'s running mate for vice president is Sara Duterte, the daughter of populist ongoing leader Rodrigo Duterte. Many of their supporters are voting to see a continuation of their policies, including his controversial war on drugs. Marcos Jr. campaigned on a platform of unity and has promised more jobs, lower prices, and more investment in agriculture and infrastructure, and also tied his campaign to his father's legacy with his slogan, Rise Again. Philippines presidential elections has ramifications beyond borders, and with China and the US increasingly treating the Indo-Pacific as a staging ground for their global showdown, the Philippines will likely come under growing economic and geopolitical pressure.
My first guest in this part of program is Mr. Rafe Tima. He's a journalist based in Philippines. He's joining me on Skype. Tima, I welcome you to my program.
Hi, hello. Thank you for having me.
And with him, I have here in studio Ms. Aruj Anwar Khan. She is analyst of politics of Southeast Asia. Ms. Aruj, I welcome you to my program as well.
Thank you so much.
Starting from you, Mr. Rafe Tima. He has won the election. There was a lot of criticism around his personality, around the human rights violation that have taken place in the checkered past that Philippines has with regards to his father. I would like to play an abstract from his speech before posting you my next question.
Ngunit kahit hindi pa tapos nga,
even if the voting is not yet done, my gratitude cannot wait. I extend my thanks to everyone, to all who helped out, to all who joined our cause, to your sacrifices, to your hard work, to your time, your abilities, your eagerness. These types of work, any endeavors as large as this, does not involve one person. It involves many people working in many different ways, and to all of them, I thank you.
So what were the factors behind his overwhelming success that was not expected for many in this part of the world?
Well, here in the Philippines, he has been leading the surveys ever since he started his campaign and when he announced that he will run for the position of president. Of course, just as a context, he also ran in 2016 as vice president, but he lost to Leni Robredo, his rival now in the 2022 presidential elections. And ever since, people were saying he already started campaigning for the highest position in the land. But when he started campaigning, he already got many endorsements, especially from local politicians, some of whom his father was able to help. He was still the president of the country. And so many were saying that he has really established himself as a future leader ever since he lost the 2016 vice presidential elections. Although he protested, he contested that result, saying he was cheated. The result actually came months before the 2022 elections. But the Supreme Court eventually said that he really lost that election. But now, of course, it appears that Marcos Jr. will win the 2022 presidential election. So the official declaration is yet to be announced. And that will be done after the Philippine Congress convenes and officially canvass the votes for the president and vice president. And that will happen in the next few days.
Don't you agree with me on the fact that the political temperature of the country had gone very high during the presidency of the previous president, Mr. Rodrigo Duterte, and many of the votes that he has bagged were as an rage from the public against the policies of the previous government?
Marcos Jr. actually promised that he will continue on with many of the policies of the outgoing administration. And that was the attraction for many of the voters, especially in the C, D, and E class. So that was the attraction. Although people are saying that the pandemic gave a pause to what was supposed to be a good governance, especially in the economy for the Duterte administration, the pandemic gave a pause to that. But Marcos Jr. is now saying that he will continue with many of his policies, especially now that his vice president is the daughter of the current president. And so continuation is one of the factors that many analysts here are saying contributed to a huge margin, the huge win of Marcos Jr. in this election.
Taking my guest in studio in the loop now. Mr. Ruj, do you agree with what my guest from Philippines has just said?
I personally believe, I may be wrong or right, but I personally believe that the vote, he had got majority of votes, but the vote he gets is because of the fact that people were not happy with the previous government. Although the Rodrigo Duterte come on the fact that he would an anti-corruption agenda, but he failed to bring anti-corrupt Philippine to the country. Another thing that people got hatred for him because of the fact that he did extrajudicial killings. So obviously,
or at least he's alleged for extrajudicial killings, which became a very popular narrative. But you believe that overwhelmingly it is because of lack of progress that he made on the anti-corruption agenda.
Yes, so that is why people wanted a change. That is why they have voted for Marcos.
Fantastic. And more importantly, I mean, his father was a president who was alleged for human rights violations as well. So do you believe he has the baggage of these human rights violations coming from the age of his father? And if you can tell me a bit more about his father's tenure, because I really don't know much of him.
Okay, so his father was an autocratic ruler, and he has ruled Philippines for almost 20 years. And his era was, according to Marcos Jr., the era of his father was a golden era for Philippines, but people do not agree with it because there was corruption, there was extrajudicial killings, physical abuses, and much more like that. Also, an autocratic rule cannot be justified in any case because it is an autocratic ruler, and he even launched a martial law on Philippines. So, but I believe that his father was from a different generation and Marcos Jr. is from a different generation, so we should give him a chance.
Coming back to you, Mr. Tima, you just heard what my guest in the studio has said. So do you believe that people have actually forgotten the injuries, that the narcissistic injuries that Philippine had during the tenure of his father, and he starts afresh with the new history?
Actually, majority of Marcos Jr. supporters see Marcos Jr. that he will bring back the supposed golden years of the Philippines started by his father. At the center of this belief are the infrastructure projects that were completed during the Marcos Sr. presidency, including bridges, hospitals, and roads. But critics of Mr. Marcos call this a disinformation and propaganda. They maintain that the borrowings and loans made during the Marcos Sr. presidency resulted in the economic downfall of the country. And of course, corruption was also a major issue, which eventually led to the ouster of Marcos Sr. from power in 1986. And Marcos's critics are saying Marcos Jr. has extensively used social media to downplay the corruption and human rights issues of his father, that history is being revised. Now, that issue is one of the main things that his critics and his rivals are using against Marcos Jr.
Fantastic. Coming back to you, Ruja. So many political observers are of the view that there was a campaign of disinformation, something that brought a lot of attention of the public towards Marcos Jr.
Yes.
Would you agree with it? And if so, why would you believe it to be a campaign of disinformation?
I personally don't believe in disinformation, but I believe in propaganda. Obviously, every politician uses propaganda techniques to influence the masses, and he was going for a presidential elections. For this purpose, he needed a propaganda technique to influence the masses, and his and the history of his family is also not good. So for this purpose, if he has used propaganda techniques, so there is nothing wrong with it.
And what is this propaganda? I mean, do you say propaganda to the propagation of a positive narrative, or something that it didn't exist? I mean, lying to people at large.
Lying to people, I would not say lying to people, but I would say that he has built a narrative. People say that a narrative built on lies, but I believe he has built a narrative that is a lie or a truth. I don't know about it, but the narrative of reunification of Philippines, because people are sick with the old narratives, they want a change. So he has given this change narrative of reunification of Philippines, which I think is good.
Your thoughts on it, Mr. Tima?
That was the allegation that Marcos Jr. has benefited from disinformation, mainly on social media. Now, we have to remember the Philippines is considered one of the heaviest users of social media in the world. A study made by an academe-based fact-checking network found out that Bongbong Marcos has positively benefited the most on disinformation circulating on social media. Most of these are positive messaging that paints a very good image of Marcos Jr., but when fact-checked, turns out to be not true. But this information are usually widely circulated and believed in by his supporters. Now, on the other hand, his opponent, Vice President Leno Robredo, was mostly impacted negatively by disinformation. Most disinformation circulating on social media are attacks against her that are made up or are twisted to make it appear, for example, that she's not intelligent or that she has no accomplishments as a politician. And this circulation of disinformation and propaganda started years before this 2022 presidential elections. As I mentioned earlier, this is not the first time Marcos and Jr. and Robredo faced off in an election. And so the Marcos camp, of course, deny they are behind any disinformation campaign. But again, according to the study, Marcos Jr. was the beneficiary of disinformation on social media.
And Mr. Rafe, importantly, there are many human rights organizations that are deeply concerned with his election to the top slot. They believe that there had been gross human rights violation during the rule of his father, and they're afraid that the same pattern will follow suit now in his government as well. What are their concerns, and how long would you agree with the concerns of these human rights organizations?
Yeah, the concern are mainly because Marcos Jr. has repeatedly said during the campaign that he would largely continue the projects and policies of President Rodrigo Duterte. Now, Marcos Jr. has also not acknowledged or apologized for the human rights violations during his father's dictatorial presidency, and so the fear is it might happen again. These are just speculations on the part of Marcos' critics, of course, but interestingly, a few days ago, when it was appearing that he is going to win, Marcos Jr.'s spokesperson said that the presumptive president wants people to judge him not by his ancestors, but by his actions. He has not fully explained what he means by this, but it obviously has something to do with the checkered past of his father when he was leading the country, now that he is poised to return to the seat of power in the Philippines 36 years after they were ousted from power and they fled the Philippines.
And as most of the viewers of my program would not know the Philippines history to that extent, would you just give me the highlights of the major human rights violation that happened during the wake of his father, and that, as according to your narrative, he has not disassociated himself with?
Well, the allegations, of course, are there are over 11,000 victims of human rights abuse here in the Philippines. Over 3,000 disappeared or were killed during his presidency. Most of these are, of course, enemies of the state, being labeled as enemies of the state. So those are the allegations. But the main allegation that drove them out of power was corruption. Of course, his wife, Imelda Marcos, was famous for having a 1,000 collection of shoes, billions of dollars worth of jewelry, and most of these are being trying to be recovered by the government. Critics of Marcos Jr. are saying that if Marcos Jr. returns to power, the allegations against them will be erased somehow. They have a 203 billion peso arrears or taxes that are not yet paid. and this might not be paid anymore. Those are the fears by the critics of the Marcos government. So those issues are still, of course, being trashed out, and all of these allegations, of course, are some of this have cases pending in court, and that is what the Marcos camp is saying, that all of these are just allegations and yet to be proven.
Thank you very much, Rafitima, for being a guest in our program. Coming back to you, Ms. Aruj, so quickly, what major challenges do you believe Philippines have today that the current government or the newly elected government will have to face?
Okay, like all Asian countries faces the major problems of corruption and ethnic separatist extremism. Corruption, if there is corruption in Philippines, obviously there would be less foreign investment, there would be poverty, and there would be less stability. So for the new government, it is essential to combat corruption from Philippines. And secondly, there is a separatist group which wants autonomous province. Is, I think it is an island of Malinado. They want, and they have pledged linkages to ISIS, which is, I think, which can be very harmful to the Philippines.
So you believe that terrorism and the support for terrorism in
yes.
some factions of the population can be a major reason. But why don't you find the economic worries of the country to be a major problem, because it's one of the most adversely hit countries from the COVID crisis
yes,
as well?
As I said before, that corruption, if there is corruption, obviously how can a country have good economy if there is corruption? If there is corruption, there would be obviously less economic growth, and the current economic growth of Philippines is per year, I think, 6%, which is very less. So it is an alarming
Thank
situation.
you very much, Aruj Anwar, for being a guest in our program.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you heard from both of our guests, there are immense problems that Philippines is facing today. The leadership that has been elected now will have not only to face these economic challenges, but also to keep the expectation of the polity intact and the interest of the public intact. We'll join you tomorrow again with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.